Hello, I'm back today with another video, and so I kind of ran out of valid stuff to talk about, and so today I'm going to be rattling off the Chinese dynasties and why they're kind of important. And so full disclosure, I am not Chinese, I am Korean American, but I've studied Asian history for a while, and so I'm pretty confident that I can kind of get through most of the dynasties and kind of explain like the importance of each dynasty in the context of like larger history. Cool. So let's just get started. So, number one, Shah, XIA, Shah. The Shah dynasty is not real. That's the most important thing. It is a myth. Most people agree. It's kind of like the Mount Olympus or like the kind of the ancient Greece Trojan War kind of period of China. And so obviously ancient Greece did exist, but you know the stories about Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, things like that. This is kind of that for China, right? So it's a very kind of history plus mythos kinds of period, right? So a lot of kind of gods and demon stories and things like that. So the Shah dynasty it kind of forms the kind of the cultural basis around entire kind of Chinese lineage from this point onwards. Cool. Okay, so after the Shah dynasty is the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty is the first historically verifiable dynasty in China. It lasts from around 1600 to 1046 BCE, apparently. And the Shang dynasty is known for something called oracle bones, right? So oracle bones are these turtle shells where people would write fortunes in like very primitive Chinese characters on these turtle shells, and they would throw them in the river, and that would basically be like the ritual that they did to uh, predict the future. And so that's kind of our first recorded version of Chinese characters. And so the Shang dynasty is basically uh, uh, basically pretty close to the actual Trojan War, actually, right? Because the Trojan War was around the 11th century BCE, most people agree. And so the Shang dynasty is kind of around a similar period. Cool, okay. And then the Zhou dynasty overthrows the Shang dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty is the longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history. And so the Zhou dynasty is very unique in that it starts as a very typical dynasty, right? So there's a king in the middle, and then there are all these kind of like local warlords. But in the later years, the local warlords start to gain more power actually than the central king. And so the kind of this phenomenon was called the spring and autumn period, and eventually the warring states period, right? So imagine, right, so you have like a central king, a central figure in the middle, but then you have all these kinds of like states or provinces basically, but eventually they start to ignore the central king and they start to kind of have a life of their own and compete with one another for hegemony over all of China. Um, so this is where most of the famous Chinese philosophy comes from, right? So Confucius, Sun Tzu, Lao Tse, all those kinds of famous people, all kind of come from this era of these different states trying to compete with one another and trying to kind of form the basis of like a new identity, right? So like, what philosophy will we organize our country under to kind of win this battle? And so the state that wins is called Qin, right? Qin. And so the king of Qin renames himself as Qin Shi Huang, or the first emperor of Qin, right? So the first emperor of Qin, he's a very famous figure, and he's basically kind of considered the founder of like modern imperial China. And Qin Shi Huang is a very tyrannical leader, right? So he's a very unpopular leader in many ways, right? But he does a lot of big building projects that are still around today. So the terracotta warriors are part of his mausoleum, and the Great Wall of China was also started by Qin Shi Huang, right? And he also builds a giant palace for himself called the Apang Palace, which is later burned down, but it was the biggest palace in the world at the time. But it was very tyrannical, and they adopted this philosophy called legalism, which basically means that if you don't follow the rules, you die. Which obviously does not go very well with kind of managing all these generals and all these people. And so it didn't last very long. If you see here, the actual dynasty only lasted like 15 years, but it's still a very important dynasty because it's the first modern unification of China. Cool. Okay, and then afterwards is the Han Dynasty. So the Han Dynasty, everybody loves the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty is like the golden age of ancient China, right? The Chinese people still actually call themselves Han Chinese, but because the Han Dynasty has just such a chokehold over like the imaginations of pretty much every dynasty that comes afterwards, right? The Han Dynasty is the gold standard for organization, for government, for peace, for everything. But even the Han Dynasty becomes very corrupt. And so at one point, right, so I know it says 202 BC to around 220 AD, right, so it's around 400 years. But in the middle of those 400 years, right, it was around the turn of the millennium, this guy overthrows the Han Dynasty very briefly and forms the Shin Dynasty or New Dynasty. So the Shin Dynasty isn't really considered a real dynasty in most kind of circles, but the Shin Dynasty lasts for a few years. It's founded by this crazy guy named Wang Mang, and he basically institutes a kind of communism for a few years in China. So he gets rid of the pay of all the court officials that he thinks are corrupt. He gets rid of slavery, which sounds all very good. But he also has like these weird fantasies about how he's like a divine figure that was sent to kind of save China. He has like this huge harem, and like overall, it's not the most morally sound leader. And so the Shin Dynasty again does not last very long. So once Wang Mang dies, the Shin Dynasty kind of collapses, and somebody restores the Han Dynasty. And so the Han Dynasty, everybody says, lasted 400 years, but there was a brief interregnum here. Cool. Okay. After the Han Dynasty is the Three Kingdoms period. So the Three Kingdoms period is extremely famous for a lot of reasons, and also I need to update this. 220 AD to 280, I believe. Okay, cool. Yeah, so the Three Kingdoms period is very famous because of this novel called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is basically the most famous novel in like pretty much all of East Asia. So there are three kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu. And so they rose out of rebellion against the Han Dynasty, but each of them kind of claimed to be the successors of the Han Dynasty. And so they fought for a while, and spoiler alert, Wei, the one above here, won. But Wei is overthrown from inside by this other guy, and he forms the Jin Dynasty. So the Jin Dynasty lasts for around 200 years. And the Jin Dynasty, there isn't a lot people know about the Jin Dynasty. Or rather, it's not that famous because it's kind of overshadowed by the fact that it was very unstable, and there were a lot of rebellions and kind of barbarian invasions from the north. And so, as those barbarians kind of came in from the north, that is the start of the Northern and Southern Dynasties period. And so, the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, again, it's not very well known. I think the only reason why somebody might know it is because I believe the story of Milan, as in the Disney movie Milan, takes place within the Northern within the Northern and Southern Dynasties period. So the Northern and Southern Dynasties, there were a series of dynasties in the north and a series of dynasties in the south. So it's not So it's not like each of them has a specific name, but yeah, they have kind of a messy history because they were all kind of going back and forth. But as always in Chinese history, somebody unites the dynasties, and now we have the Sui Dynasty. So the Sui Dynasty is very similar to the Qin Dynasty in a lot of ways, in that it reunites China after a long period of disunity. But it's also very tyrannical. And so, so just like how the Qin Dynasty created the Terracotta Warriors and the Great Wall of China, the Sui Dynasty created the Grand Canal, right? So the Grand Canal connects, I believe it's Hangzhou to Beijing, right? So around like the coast to the capital. And it's a massive project. And so it is a Grand Canal, right? It's a very big project, but it's a very, very massive undertaking. And there's a lot of very innocent peasants are kind of extorted for their labor in this whole process. Cool. Okay, so after the very unpopular Sui Dynasty, and also they invaded Korea at some point, which didn't go very well for them. After that, this new guy reunited the empire and formed the Tang Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty is again a golden age for China. The Tang Dynasty is kind of the second kind of golden age after the Han Dynasty for China, and so a lot of southern Chinese people especially call themselves Tang people, right? So Tang is also a synonym for Chinese, and so I believe Chinatowns in the West are called Tang people like Tang towns or Tang people towns, right? Because in especially southern China, um, uh, the entirety of China is still associated with the Tang Dynasty, and because southern China was kind of officially Sinicized around this era, right? So up until this point, southern China has kind of been like a very ethnically mixed area. But this is the period where the Tang Dynasty first becomes first. Uh, 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 this is the period where southern China officially becomes kind of more culturally Chinese in a lot of ways. Cool. So that's the Tang Dynasty. And so after a lot of rebellions and things like that, there is another interregnum, very briefly, called the Zhou Dynasty. So, a very interesting story. So, one of the concubines in the imperial harem of the Tang Dynasty, um, called Wu Zetian, uh, eventually overthrows the actual emperor and proclaims herself emperor. And so she is the first and only female empress of China, called Empress Wu. And so she briefly declares a new dynasty called the Zhou dynasty, right? So this is, it's called Wu Zhou. And so it's basically the same as the Tang dynasty, except she basically, this entire dynasty was just named after herself as a fancy justification for why she killed everybody to get the power. But then, after she gets to power, the Tang dynasty is restored, and so you can see here that it lasts for around 200 years afterwards. But then again, obviously, it becomes corrupt and falls. And next is the Song dynasty. So the Song dynasty is actually a very interesting dynasty. It's very unpopular in China just because it's very militarily weak. But the Song dynasty is home to a lot of really big innovations. Really big innovations that we associate with China, right? So like the earliest forms of gunpowder, more advanced forms of paper, which was invented earlier, but it's kind of like more refined. A lot of printing technology, almost to the point where some people say that the Song Dynasty almost reached an industrial revolution at some point. I'm not sure how much that's true, but what is clear is that the Song Dynasty was very uh, techno- technologically advanced, even though they weren't very militarily strong. Cool. Okay. Now, around this time, a giant hurricane kind of sweeps through all of Eurasia, called the Mongols. So the Mongols come in and they establish the Yuan dynasty. So the Yuan dynasty is the first completely foreign dynasty of China, where the entire ruling class, or most of the ruling class, are Mongols. So they're no longer Han Chinese, and then but most of the people that are being ruled are Chinese. And so eventually the ruling Mongols also kind of adopt Chinese culture, right? So they're not, right? So by the later periods, right? Like they're all speaking Chinese, they all have kind of like Chinese customs and things like that. But it is still considered a very kind of class-based society where the Mongols are definitely at the top and the Han Chinese are at the bottom. And so the Yuan dynasty lasts for a little under a century, but it's the biggest, the biggest dynasty in Chinese history, just because the entire Mongol Empire was huge, obviously, and they just kind of split this kind of Chinese area and just called it the Yuan dynasty. And then after the Yuan dynasty, the Red Turban Rebellion kind of rose up against Yuan rule and formed the Ming dynasty. Okay, the Ming dynasty lasts for a few hundred years, and the Ming dynasty is kind of considered like default China. The Ming dynasty is very kind of very typically very Confucian and very upright in a lot of ways. So they have a lot of kind of famous cultural works, right? So a lot of the famous novels that you might have heard of from China, right? From Journey to the West with the Monkey King to the Three Kingdoms, to a lot of those kind of works are compiled in around kind of the Yuan Ming era, right? So it's very Confucian. It's very Confucian. It's led by the Han Chinese, which is a very big deal in history. And the Ming Dynasty is overall just considered as a very good, good upright dynasty. And it's also considered kind of a golden age in a lot of ways. And it is also the last time a native ethnic Han Chinese um, uh, lineage rules China for quite a while after this. And then after the Ming Dynasty is the last imperial dynasty of China, called the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty is very interesting. So again, the Qing Dynasty is not ethnically Han Chinese; it is Manchu. So the Manchu people are from around this area called Manchuria, and they come in from the northeast here, and they invade mainland China, and they eventually conquer all of mainland China, and Tibet, and Xinjiang, and Mongolia, and all of this to basically form the second biggest empire in Chinese history, right? So the biggest was the Mongols, but that was like the 13th century, right? So it's kind of different standards. But the Qing Dynasty is much bigger, and it is just a giant behemoth of an empire. And so it is the last imperial dynasty of China. It lasts for around 300 years. And again, just like the Mongol Yuan dynasty, by the end, the Manchu rulers have completely adopted Chinese customs, and so they are no longer speaking their native tongue, Manchu. They are speaking Chinese. They are kind of having all these Chinese customs. They have these Chinese temple names and so forth. And so it's kind of part of this very typical process of like losing what your losing their native kind of culture, and kind of being reverse assimilated into the people that they conquered. Cool. Okay. So after the Qing Dynasty is a whole host of a lot of different things that have happened in Chinese history, but we'll cover that in a later video. But for now, we've just covered the Imperial Dynasty of China, which ends in 1911. And so a lot of different things, but I hope this helped in some way. And so I think we might do a proper kind of deep dive into a lot of these dynasties later on. But for now, all you need to know is that this is kind of the order of the dynasties and like the context of what was kind of going on around that time. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.